this is not a treaty. This is there is no there are no binding penalties that will occur if they are not honored, and there is no real operational guidance for national or local governments on how they should be implemented, right? There are very few implementation mechanisms, and in the nature of an event, of a global conference like this, a signing, is that these are national governments that are signing. However, we're looking at local governments who are implementing, or civil society implementing. So, will this work? What will this achieve? And what really changes will occur between now and after the conference? Like, what is going to be different? Well, the answer is that we don't know. It's very difficult to say. And judging by what we may know about some of our New Year's resolutions, where perhaps we shouldn't be too enthusiastic about this, right? And really, the only way of knowing what's going to happen in the future is to look back. Okay, so well, let's use the past as a guide. Let's look backwards, and perhaps history will inform us. Okay, and so this is the third Habitat event, and 20 years ago in Istanbul there was Habitat 2. Now, I'd like to ask, so has anybody heard about Habitat 2? Is anybody at Habitat 2 or remembers any of the sort of the statements that came out of that? Okay, well, maybe many of us are not, weren't around at that point, so it was 20 years ago. But there's probably a reason why, not many people can cite or remember what was said or what were the statements that came out of that. Okay, that was the Habitat 2 agenda or the Habitat agenda. It was a very long document. There was 238 paragraphs, very dense, no numbers, no references for what national governments were obliged to or what they should be doing. It was very siloed. It was not very interdisciplinary, and it really lacked any effective implementing mechanism or a way to assess the fulfillment of those commitments. And in the end, very little was actually achieved. That delivered very little. And I think that that's important for us to reflect upon. Now, the official line of the executive director of UN Habitat, John Kloss, who's putting this together, is that, look, past, quote unquote, is history. And let's not look back, let's look forward, okay? And there's very little acknowledgement by delegates in this process of the importance of assessing what has happened in the past, right? As a way of moving forward, or the need to evaluate that process in terms of informing what should happen. And I think that that is a mistake, because we need to take advantage of a historical perspective to think about what are some of the gaps and what are some of the pitfalls, and how can we learn from our past failures or our past shortcomings in order to do better. So we're here today because we all feel very strongly about the importance of urban poverty in our communities and cities and society. And I am concerned that in the Habitat 3 document there is really a lack of recognition of what urban poverty is. Urban poverty is treated as a sociological or of an economic phenomena. Something that occurs in a tabula rasa or occurs in a way that's isolated or somehow not connected with a sense of place. And I think we understand that there are reasons why poverty exists and persists in the city, and those reasons are because where the poor are relates to their lack of access or spatial inequalities in terms of access to jobs, to mobility, to rights, to tenure, to institutions, to public services. There are inequalities in our cities that really need to be addressed, recognized, before that we can come up with solutions to them. The city is an extremely political and complex place, and we need to be able to really confront that. Now, perhaps this is not a surprise that this document doesn't recognize it. It was drafted by diplomats and politicians. But, I think that we need to take this opportunity here to think about what can be done about this, because we do understand and live in this context. And I do think this is an important occasion because it puts the issue at the front and center. Cities, urban development clearly are a very important global phenomena that this event brings to the forefront into perspective. And I think we should take advantage of that. Now, what does this mean for Asia? Okay, urbanization in Asia, and there's a really interesting image that kind of really brings this, relates this sense of scale to me. I don't know if you've seen it, but it's an image of, it's an aerial image, a satellite image of the world. Okay, it's a map, and there's a circle, and the circle is located right above or right around China, Southeast Asia, bit of Indonesia. Okay, so if the world is this size, you have this circle right here hovering. Okay, it can't take up more than maybe say a sixth or a seventh of the world. And the caption on the top of that says, "There are more people who live inside this circle than live outside." And that is it really kind of brings home this sense of where people are living in the world, right? People are living in Asia. People there, this is where you have the highest rates of urbanization, the largest numbers of people living in cities, perhaps the largest number of megacities in the world, and the highest numbers in scale of urban poor. You have issues like climate change, which are really threatening our cities, and we're democratic and more accountable. We're finding countries like India, China, Thailand becoming less democratic, where perhaps having an event like this would not really even be possible. So clearly, implementing the new urban agenda is going to be a challenge in this region. But I want to take this opportunity to pause and reflect, because I don't see this, I see this as an opportunity. And I think that this is an opportunity for Bangladesh in a country that abounds with potential and opportunities. Okay, so I'd like to reflect on some of the things that I think are important for really achieving, honoring commitments, and how that can be thought of in terms of what we are trying to do today and what we're trying to get going. So what is needed to fulfill these commitments? Well, firstly, I think leadership and a commitment from government. And we are seeing this with national governments and local governments. They're getting involved. They're supporting with other institutions, really making an impact. And we need more of that. We need more resources. We need better, more leadership, more involvement. We really need to take this, help to push governments forward. We need to actively engage civil society. And I think there's no better example of that than this event today. This is a civil society led and initiated event, and it's taking on the problem. It's organizing, it's innovating, and it's bringing new thinking. We need the courage to take on the issue. Okay, when we have when we have making our own commitments, we need the courage to be able to see them through. And I'm very impressed by organizations, for example, in Bangladesh that are taking on issues like climate change. We have in this room today ICAD, other universities and researchers. These are very difficult issues that are being taken on, that are really, we're exploring and we're sharing information and know-how about those. And that is something that's not just being useful for Bangladesh, but for the entire world. This is something that Bangladesh is leading in. And we've really got to think about a clear set of guidelines about what it is that how it is that we can implement. Okay, we need to think about implementing these changes. The program that I'm involved in, called the National Urban Poverty Reduction Program, we are looking at understanding the context of poverty, contextualizing it within the city, analyzing what's going on in the city, and really focusing on delivering change, working with governments, following their lead of what they want, their vision for the city, but inserting a poverty reduction agenda into that. Because at the end of the day, it's about results and how we can bring those about, and we really need to think about ways to deliver that. And I strongly believe we need to think about assessing our progress, monitoring what it is, how are we doing with these goals, right? If our goal by the end of the year is to, lose weight, how are we doing every month? We're not going to just arrive there at the end and it's going to magically happen. So we need to have a frank and honest, continuous discourse about how that can happen. And I think that this is a challenge that perhaps I'd like to suggest that we will think about who's going to do what, how we can achieve these goals, and have a continuous discussion about the progress made towards those. In our own lives, making commitments requires or honoring commitments, it requires starting with ourselves, right? It's not about, we can't start by just pushing it onto someone else. We have to think about what it takes, and do we have the leadership, do we have the supportive network of people working with us to make it happen? Do we have the commitment and the courage to see it through? Are we assessing our own progress? We can't just think of urban poverty as a problem for the national government to take on and then, it becomes a top-down solution. It has to start with ourselves, and then it can, be our community and our society, and we need to think about that. And, I really believe that we can see this as an opportunity, and urbanization as an opportunity to be able to reduce urban poverty. If we're leveraging the prosperity and distributing it and allowing the poor to be able to access it, then I think that we're really going to see ourselves making a lot of strides towards honoring those commitments and making a change. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Now I call upon Professor David Hume, Executive Director of Global Development Institute in the University of Manchester. He will speak on climate variability, vulnerability, and poor people in urban areas. Professor Hume, sir.
Okay, it's a great honor to be able to talk to you today, and it's always great to be back in Bangladesh. A confession early on, I've come here to learn about sort of urban poverty and urban development. Hopefully I can contribute to the talks, but I think we've got an incredible wealth of people who know so much about what's happening in Dhaka, in Chittagong, in Khulna, in smaller towns and centres to seize upon. So I'll try to make a contribution. I'm going to stick to the title which had been given to me to think about looking at climate variability and vulnerability. But some of the opening points I'll go quickly through, but I think some of them may have been made already, and I'll skip over those, but some of them I think we need to think about when we're thinking of this issue of urban poverty and how it relates to national development and improved well-being for the population. Oh, that's not going to work. Okay. Can you teach me how to use this one? So it's left, right. Point and... Hey, okay, great. That's great. Thank you very much. The first thing I think, which has sort of been pointed out already, is that urban poverty in Bangladesh has been neglected in policy and also by researchers, by myself and colleagues. There's a link on these, and if we can get this on the PPRC website, that will take you to a paper that tries to explore why it's been neglected. But very quickly, if we look at why policies neglected it, there's been a misunderstanding of the data. If you look at average economic or social conditions in urban areas and rural areas in Bangladesh, then the urban areas are much better off. But that doesn't mean that you can neglect the urban areas, because there is this at least 1/3 of the population that is deeply deprived, living in extreme poverty, experiencing very low level quality of living, and we have to think about what to do with that very disadvantaged urban group. It's partly due to political party histories, looking for Shona Bongla, looking for a sort of a country which isn't actually a rapidly urbanizing modern country. It's also connected to the politics. Politicians find it much more difficult in urban areas to connect through social protection programs to poorer communities, whereas in rural areas you can build government programs much more into political activities. Researchers have also neglected it. That's partly because of a lack of data, partly because of the structure of the economics discipline, and many of Bangladesh's leading thinkers are economists, but urban economics is not something that has evolved particularly well. And it's partly because of Bangladesh's great success in research at looking at rural poverty that's tended to create careers that look at rural poverty and extreme poverty in rural areas. So the whole set of reasons for that. And that's this sort of legacy that we've got makes this conference incredibly important to get urban poverty onto the agenda, urban poverty into policy, and also urban poverty into research and into what people are thinking about at universities and teaching institutions in Bangladesh. Okay, stay there. I'm drawing on the work of a lot of other people, so if you click on that, that will take you through to a lot of the publications, some at the University of Manchester, some with partners in Bangladesh that we're working on, particularly Manoj Roy, Nicola Banks, Sally Carwood, and Ferdas Jahan. And it's drawing very much on work on Dhaka and Chittagong and Khulna. In Bangladesh, that's not too bad because there's a relatively small part of the urban population that lives outside of those three cities. But in other parts of the world, then actually we have to think about urbanization on a much more broad-based basis. This is the confessional one, eh? I'm also a rural development wallet. It's only about 15 years ago that I began to look at poorer people in urban areas. Only about 10 years ago that I really began to think systematically about talking with people and collecting data on those areas. And I don't know, it'd be interesting to hear what other people think. I find poverty and deprivation in urban areas much understand than in rural areas. In rural areas, if you work out what the landless people are doing, what the small farms are doing, what the landlords are doing, you can begin to get a pattern which you find repeated in different ways in villages nearby. In urban areas, I find that if I'm looking at a community that lives beside the railway track, it's quite different than one that lives beside a jute mill. It's quite different from one which is out at Berribad in the new sort of professional slums that are being built, and that the different localities, people have very different livelihoods, often very different sets of problems they're facing. And I think that one of the things we're going to have to be very careful about in understanding urban poverty in the future is that much of our knowledge about slums is on the lands that were initially settled, the government lands, where you have a large number of people that manage to get access to land. Increasingly, I think the slums, the busties in Bangladesh, are going to be these more professional buildings that are being built in places such as Berribad, where you have professional contractors building 100, 200, 300 slum units, and that these have quite different sets of livelihoods, quite different set of problems. Yeah, I'm never going to get this right, apologies. This seems to be skipping. Do you know how to work this one? I'll talk while you can maybe... Oh, let's stick with this one. There's a set of conceptual confusions I think we also need to be careful about. One of the very important ones is to think about this idea of urban problems and rural problems, urban poor and rural poor. This is a useful device at times, but it's a false dichotomy. It leads people to sometimes ask questions that can be quite dangerous, because actually if you look at why Bangladesh has been prospering, if you look at why human development has been improving in Bangladesh, it's because of the flows between rural and urban areas, the flows of people from rural to urban areas, the investments of capital that have often come from urban areas outside of Bangladesh, the ideas that have come in, and it's actually those flows that explain why life's been getting better for many people in urban areas and for many people in rural areas. It's dangerous because it can lead to foolish questions or dangerous questions. And certainly one of the ones that's worried me sometimes is that recently when I've been talking about urban poverty and the need to address urban poverty, then I've got the question, so should we take money away from the rural poor and we'll give it to the urban poor instead? And questions which aren't seeing the connections between urban development and rural development. And I'd argue that certainly if you move away from this dangerous dichotomy, then you'd be asking, you know, how can we create an urban infrastructure that meets the needs of all our citizens? Because there are improvements that you can make in urban areas that knock onto rural areas. If you make an infrastructure that makes livelihoods more productive in urban areas and that creates more jobs for poor people in urban areas, that knocks onto the rural wage market, and rural wages will go up at the same time. And it's important that we keep these things connected and realize it's not a trade-off. We can make urban improvements that will also contribute to improvements in the lives of poor rural people. There's certainly a danger that this division between urban and rural has led to rural poor people being seen as deserving by politicians and urban poor people seen as undeserving, as volunteering to be poor by coming to the city when they don't have the skills to be middle-class people. And a final couple of points. I am often distressed by the idea of urban planning, particularly as it's taught in universities, because it just doesn't seem to connect with the sorts of planning problems that exist in cities like Chittagong and Dhaka. It still seems to me to be based very much upon ideas of procedural planning, of the sorts of things that were done in the West 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago, and is not relevant to the very much market-driven processes that are occurring in Dhaka, in Chittagong and Khulna, where law and certainly law and legal enforcement are negotiable or malleable, and you can't simply assume that you can zone areas and that zoning will apply. If you look at the evolution of Gulshan, then you're in a fantasy land if you think that had anything to do with procedural planning. When you look at the height of those buildings and the way that all the green land and the beals have been encroached. So we need to try and think somehow about how we can get ideas about planning and what planners do that would be useful. Hey, this is really confusing, eh? Okay, you've had that one already from my colleague Dinah Mitlin. If you link to the web link on this, then you'll get, hey, some sort of delay on it. So use that one, okay. If you link to the, oh, that's brilliant, okay. If you link to the website, then you'll get the detailed Mitlin and Satterthwaite elegant explanation of how to conceptualize urban poverty and disadvantage. Let's move on to the work that we've been doing looking at urban poverty and climate change. And this work we focused on because we think urban poverty's been neglected, but we also think that climate change, whilst it's been taken very serious in Bangladesh by researchers and by policy, that actually we haven't done sufficient to think about how climate change will impact on the lives of poorer people in urban areas. This has been looking very much at the processes of adaptation and how people living in slums in Dhaka, Chittagong and Khulna have been dealing with the climate variability that increasingly seems to be affecting their lives, with the sorts of environmental problems that get more intense as climate change occurs. It's partly been based upon surveys, but it's also used other methods, particularly extended interviews with households and trying to understand how individual households have responded, and group exercises in which people have been able to analyse how they're responding to change. And I mean, just to illustrate this, I was going to show you this diagram that just gives us an idea. This is someone who is presently living out at Berrybad, but we got him and his wife to sit down and talk about their lives in the slums since 1980. I'll just go through it very quickly, but these sorts of lives, when you get people to think about what's been happening and how things chart out for them, are not atypical. This is a household that they moved into Bangladesh, into Dhaka from Bola back in 1980. They managed to establish a household, basic structure, but there was a fire in the bustee in which they were living, and this meant that they had to rebuild their property. Things began to improve up until 1998, and then the big floods of 1998 means that the house was flooded. They moved out at that stage, and they ended up relocating. Again, a period of reconstruction and redevelopment of the household, some stability, but then in 1998, large floods again, and so relocation, moving out at that stage to Bury Bad. And we find this a constant situation in which there are periods of stability, but then incidents often to do with environmental challenges, such as flooding, sometimes to do with fire, which mean that households have to relocate, the asset bases get stripped back to very low levels, and they have to rebuild their assets. We looked at this for a very large number of households, and we then packaged them into a very simple framework that we're looking at to see about how urban households are actually adapting to the environmental challenges which climate variability and climate change are making increasingly difficult. At the bottom of this ladder of adaptation comes acquiescence. That's when households and communities simply absorb the impacts of these particular risks and of the vulnerabilities that they create. It just means that maybe you're getting more heat stress, so you're just hotter. You can't actually do anything about it. You just have to experience that heat stress. It may be that waterlogging is for several months rather than several weeks. And again, you just have to acquiesce to it. You just have to wade around in dirty water for a much longer period. It may be that you've got a lower income because your livelihood is impacted on, and so you just accept that. So that's the very bottom, in a way, of this ladder. Moving on to coping, that's when there are strategies that allow, to some limited degree, a capacity to manage with the increased risks and with the vulnerabilities of living in a bustee. Often those are at the household level, and they're about reducing the impact of these particular risks. Very simple things. Obviously having boards at the front of your house that maybe will keep the water out of your house so that you can block floods. Some houses, many houses nowadays, are redesigning themselves in the busties so they get an airflow through, so that actually during the hot periods of year they're getting a bit more cooling air coming through. Finance is often important, and many households are actually looking for ways in which they can make savings and or get access to loans quickly, so that when they are hit by a problem they can manage it better. Though interestingly, often these things may be perverse in terms of the understanding of outsiders. Very detailed studies back in 1998 of SafeSave borrowers found that as the waters came up in the big floods of 1998, we thought that people would take their savings out, but they actually made more savings during the early days, and that's because they were anticipating that if the floods were high, they were going to have big problems. So it made sense to try and reduce your consumption during the first week or two of the flood so that you had more savings to draw down when the floods actually totally took over your household. So a whole set of coping mechanisms. When one moves to progressive adaptation, this is when you get coping, but you also get often a community level capacity to adapt institutions, to begin to negotiate some of the institutional arrangements, even the minor policy arrangements, so that you can improve quite significantly what's happening. Very hard to find examples of progressive adaptation in Dhaka and Chittagong and Khulna. A really good one that one could identify is something like the DSK-Dewasa link in getting potable water supplies to communities which are not registered, have informal land holdings, and the breakthrough that that's led through in actually extending water supplies. And then finally there is the idea of transformative adaptation, when actually the crises that people and communities face leads them to organize so that they actually demand policy and institutional changes that will allow them to build their lives in the future, demanding access to secure land, demanding low-income housing policies, demanding that they get greater security of tenure. These sorts of achievements we did not locate anywhere in Bangladesh. So quickly, let's just summarize one or two of the main findings. We certainly found that the sort of frameworks that I was showing, these multi-dimensional ideas about urban poverty, are very useful and essential. And certainly this idea about how you could look at a ladder of adaptation, and if you're a policymaker or a social activist, you'd be asking, how can we help households and communities move up this ladder of adaptation so that they can actually begin to renegotiate policies, renegotiate the institutional activities that are blocking their progress. We certainly found that the vulnerability to the types of changes that will be pushed by climate change is very high, partly because most of these sites in which the urban poor are concentrated are high-risk environments in environmental terms, and partly because the asset basis of these households is very low. They haven't got assets that they can deal with very easily. We found that certainly the desire of external agents to be able to identify the impacts of climate change, that was not particularly beneficial, because for the households and for understanding what was happening, then it was understanding in a way the risks and the vulnerability in the round. The households are not just dealing with climate, they're dealing with changes in prices, they're dealing with changes in government policy, changes in the labour market, and they deal with those problems in the round. They don't strip them out individually. And the final comment certainly was that if one's looking at what's happening internationally, then poor people are largely doing it for themselves. There's a lot of talk, as we heard at Habitat 2 and now at Habitat 3, about what national governments will do, about what international agents are doing. But most of the work, most of the adaptation is actually being done by poor households themselves or poor communities. Finally, then, some main findings from Bangladesh. Certainly, this rather depressing finding that at the moment most of the adaptation to climate variability is at the level of acquiescence or coping. People are just having to accept lower living standards or to cope in minor ways with what's happening. Some evidence of progressive adaptation, particularly in terms of that DSK, Dewasa policy and some other initiatives that have actually changed institutional frameworks and given poor people access to services that they couldn't access. There seem to be two main reasons in Bangladesh why it's been difficult in a way to move towards progressive adaptation and transformative. One is that the cities of Bangladesh seem to be difficult environments in which to be able to develop dynamic federations of the urban poor. The politics of being poor in urban areas somehow don't lead themselves into allowing people to form very dynamic and effective groups that will demand that their lives be improved. I mean, in Dhaka, as we heard, 1/3 of the population are living in slums, are urban poor, but they're not able to organize in any way politically, which actually makes their lack of security of land tenure, their lack of access to water, their lack of sanitation, major problems, whether that's for the city council or for the national government. So it's been very hard to get people to organize. And then secondly, the fact that the urban poor are systematically marginalized in contemporary policies. They're simply not allowed or absorbed. What to do in the future? Well, I think we have to think about how to get up this ladder, how to get towards progressive adaptation, transformative adaptation. One of the ideas that academics often float about this is the right to the city, but I wonder whether the idea here should be that we move on beyond this idea of urban poverty, and we need to recognize that we need inclusive urban development in Dhaka, in Chittagong and Khulna, and not just think about poverty alleviation and social protection and other very good things, but to think about how we get an urban infrastructure that is meeting the needs of present citizens and of future citizens. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Our final keynote speech is by today's Chair and Executive Chairman of PPRC, Dr. Hussain Zillur Rahman. He will speak on urban poverty in Bangladesh, challenges of perspective and action.
Good morning. People have been welcomed, but I would like to add two additional, I would like to recognize Professor David Hume, for example, who just spoke. He flew in yesterday and will fly back tomorrow, all the way from Manchester for this conference. Thank you, David, for that. And well, we can give a clap, I think. And also there are a number of members of city governments from around the country who are here, mayors, councillors, and various city functionaries. I would like to also recognize their presence. I'll start with my presentation, which you're all Firoz, if you can help me. Okay, I want to start. I think David just started it. I want to start by taking us out of this room into the realities of the urban poor. And I want to look at 10 faces. These PPRC commissioned actually a young student from Vassar College, New York, a Bangladeshi student, to make a photo essay on the urban poverty for this conference. And we'll just have a look at some of these. This is Rubel, factory worker in Puran Dhaka. I think we need to look at their physical appearance to understand the realities in which the urban poor live actually. He's speech impaired, works to support his widowed mother, did not go to school. These are the life stories which we are trying to really analyze in our in our papers, sorry. That's Rubel. Okay. Next, it's a Jewel, who is a school dropout, a construction worker. That's in Uttara somewhere. And you can see at the end of the day, these are the lives. They're working. Someone is taking a shower. He's trying to have his dinner. That's the type of everyday realities that the poor are going through. This is Abdur Rab, worker in a small mattress factory. He migrated to Dhaka alone, brought his wife along, children, and his greatest struggle now is to ensure that his daughter finishes school. So we can see the types of aspirations which are driving these members of the urban poor, and the type of strategies that they are adopting to try and improve their own lives. This is Omol, 43, rickshaw puller from Uttara. He comes from Mymensingh. He is a different type actually. He came to work to Dhaka till Eid for a defined period of time to earn income, and then he plans to go back. And he confided that he was thinking which gifts to take for his children. This is Badsha, a fruit seller in Shodoghat. They come on launches with their wares and returns when they have sold enough. He finds it hard to make ends meet, especially with the rise of price. He is not necessarily a resident of Dhaka, but in this larger discussion of urban poverty, they also have to be brought in actually. They are economic actors on the Dhaka scene. That's some of the young children of the poor. The middle one is called Rahul. He helps his father in his business, but his father has asked him to concentrate on his studies. And as you can see, the parents put a lot of emphasis on the education of their children as a way of getting out of poverty. He likes to become a businessman and have his ambition is up to a limited one, a chain of grocery stores across Dhaka. And that's his father, Abdul Mullah, who is a petty businessman. He is, these are the economic realities. That's Buriganga across the river. You can see the Dhaka skyline. And he is hoping for his son, who is planning to have a grocery store chain, that he gets what he thinks is a real job in the future. And this is Nilima. who is finding an unusual moment of relaxation actually. The bond between animal and humans, as you can see, is quite deep in these sort of existence. And lastly, this is Meena, 11 years old student from Shakhari Bazar, lives in a one-bedroom house with a family. Dad works at a neighboring factory. This was in the middle of the summer, and her biggest desire at that time was an air conditioner for her house. She wants to grow up to be a nurse. So these are the lives that I think today's discussion wants to bring into focus. They, in the definitions as has been mentioned by David, by Ming, by John Taylor, our definitions of how we try to capture these people have to also evolve with time. The multidimensionality has been mentioned several times. The back and forth that David mentioned in terms of adaptation, that has been mentioned. So urban poverty really presents a challenge of analytics, of statistics, and of making sense, policy sense, of what to do about it. This conference is been organized on the basis of a major research that we have done, PPRC in collaboration with BBS, as was mentioned before. And the research is on the urban spectrum. We talk of urbanization, and I think we have seen that Gulshan and Shatkhira are both urban, but worlds apart actually. One is nearer to the first world, the other is very much in the third world. So we wanted to capture this urban spectrum, and the surveys are Dhaka city actually has been surveyed once in 2012, will be surveyed again, actually is surveyed again this year. Chittagong city this year, 8 city corporations this year, and 14 municipalities this year. This is at this level of city level data has been missing in Bangladesh. We have rural urban, but not city level data. And the reason in partnership with BBS, we have tried to construct this urban database based at the city level. And of course, the research has been supported, as was mentioned earlier, by the World Bank. And in this conference, we are presenting only the findings of Dhaka 2012, Chittagong 2016, and the Purushavas 2016. I want to quickly rush through my presentation by asking 5 questions. I've already asked this one earlier. Is urbanization an undifferentiated reality? An answer obviously has already been answered to some extent by earlier speakers. It is not. Metropolitan to Mofussil. I want to popularize this word for particularly guests who have come from abroad. Mofussil is a local word, but I hope it will become part of the urban language, if not in Habitat 3, then in Habitat 4. It is a reality which is urban. It's not rural. Mofussil doesn't mean rural. It is urban. But it refers to a urban reality which is distinctly lower in all senses compared to metropolitan centers. And much of the urban realities in our countries like ours are actually Mofussil realities. And transforming those Mofussil realities is as much a challenge as improving the lives of the urban poor in Dhaka city. Second question I want to ask is how adequate is the income measure to capture the multidimensionality of urban poverty? And I think answers have already been coming forth that it is not adequate. We need several other indicators, and I myself have been engaged on rural poverty research for a long time, and it is true Bangladeshi economists have really done a wonderful job on analyzing rural poverty. But I think it's time that we need to engage on the issues of urban poverty with the equal level of engagement that we did for rural poverty. The reason is also urban poverty statistics. The question I'm asking, do urban poverty statistics face a problem of being outdated vis-a-vis changing urban realities? BBS people are here in force. They use certain categories, their questionnaires when they use them for making surveys, use categories, about housing, about etc. As we will see later, there is a problem that the available typologies on these issues actually may have been overtaken by urban changing realities. So we need actually new typologies, new sort of characterizations. Fourth, we have mentioned multidimensionality, but I want to put a sharper focus on that question, on this word multidimensionality. And the fourth question that I pose is that, do the urban poor face a reality of economic opportunities but social disadvantages? Because everyone is saying also that urbanization is good for growth. They're coming to the cities for economic opportunities. But there is a reality of economic opportunities but social disadvantages. Housing, education, social protection, health, etc. All of those indicators, some of them are showing that they may be even worse off than the rural poor. So this conflicted reality has to be brought into focus. And lastly, and this is the larger, in fact, Habitat 3 level question, is urban poverty about the poor, or is it about anti-poor urbanization? Because the two are slightly different. If you're talking of the poor only, then social protection, some targeted program, etc. But if it is about anti-poor urbanization, in the way, for example, infrastructure policies are set, which favors the elite, not the masses, at that level, we have to take the agenda actually. So it's not just about targeted programs a la the rural poverty syndrome. In the urban context, often urban poverty, dealing with it, is about altering the anti-poor urbanization which may be enforced. But I don't want to give the definitive answers to this. I'm posing this as questions on which our research will have to bring forth the more. I have my hunches, I have already offered them, but these are the questions I pose, and now let me give some empirical answers, preliminary answers to this. For example, in terms of differentiated reality, this is directly from our survey data. The metropolitan Mofussil divide. Look at Dhaka, Chittagong, and the 14 municipalities. This is a table. You will in fact get a book later in the conference where these are available in greater depth, but let me move to the next slide, which draws the conclusions. The reason there is differentiation, average municipality income is 45% lower than Dhaka income, nearly half actually. Even Chittagong, which is the second largest city supposed to be, has 30% lower income than Dhaka city. In Dhaka, on that global criteria of $1.25 per day, it's 27% was poor in 2012, but if we use decile analysis, we find about 34 actually in 2012. We'll have figures for 2016 also. Average income in Dhaka is about 38,000 per month. But if you decompose, we find that there is a very strong variation. Lowest income class across this spectrum has income level below 8,000 in Dhaka city. That's like the borderline in which the extreme poor live actually. Those are the realities we have to, because if we think of 38,000 Taka average income, it gives a different picture. 8,000 Taka for that group, it's a different picture. Also, I think we have to think of, the poor are there, but just above the poor there is a vast group whom I'll call for this conference, let me call them lower middle class. They constitute in fact the majority of urban population, with a monthly income between 10,000 and 25,000. And they are 47% of Dhaka city residents, 56% in Chittagong, 49% in Purushabhas, meaning they are the dominant group actually. Sometimes extreme poverty may be low in urban areas compared to rural areas, but just above that, there's the large group who exist. So this is Certainly it's a differentiated reality. There are other indicators on which to understand this differentiation in terms of quality of life, owner-occupied housing. We have used several variables. In some areas, Bangladesh certainly has improved, but Dhaka has, even the poor in Dhaka vis-a-vis housing has a better situation. It's 5% only vulnerable housing, but it's higher in Chittagong and Purushabas. Non-sanitary latrine, shared latrine use, etc., etc. There are several indicators which shows a variation across the urban spectrum. Now let me just come to this idea of outdated typologies by which we are currently collecting urban statistics. Housing, let's come to that. Now we typically ask, what is the structure? Is it kacha, jhupri, or is it semi-pakka or pakka, meaning building? Housing structure is the variable we use. But we find, for example, we had a debate with BBS. They said your data must be wrong. Poor, but you are saying their housing structure is showing pakka building. How can that be? We went back to the questionnaire and found that no, data is correct, but it's a new reality. They are not occupying that whole of that thing. It's what's called sublet, meaning a small space, but within a durable structure. Now, future BBS surveys will have to incorporate these sort of categories if we want to really capture the reality of urban life. Land tenure security has been mentioned, but also now we find rental insecurity is an issue. The reason people change houses, one of the important reasons we found was problematic relationship with the landlord on variety of issues. So it's not just land tenure insecurity, it's also rental insecurity as an issue. Sanitation, we have used, pakka latrine or not, but on that, huge improvement. But the reality is pakka latrine, but now 10 families have to use that one latrine. Shared use is the new reality. We have to bring that on board as an indicator. Access to infrastructure, access to road infrastructure. We asked the question, differentiated roads, arterial roads, main arterial, and inner roads, meaning the ones which are used every day. And we found that there's a distinct quality difference. The inner roads are in a more dilapidated state than the arterial roads. But for the poor, is those inner roads which actually define their everyday movement. And for them, it's a very great concern. Access to electricity, again, all across Bangladesh now, do you have a connection? Almost 100%. No longer it's really capturing the reality, because the reality is the intensity of interrupted supply. In Purushabas, 2 to 6 hours power breaks for 56% of the households. That's the type of realities which now are the new indicators which we have to discuss. Some challenges which are less in focus, elitist bias in setting urban priorities. For example, in Bangladesh, public transportation, urban social protection, urban health, low-cost housing are relatively on the lower priority. Urbanization is seen as a, uncritically seen as a growth agenda. But inadvertently, within that uncritical formulation, you have the reflection of the elite priorities rather than the priorities of this larger majority of people. These are the lesser focus which you have to bring out. Viable pro-poor urban solution, that's a very important issue. Challenge here really is of innovation. Because sometimes we talk of zero-sum game, that some only have to be given to the, if to be given to the poor, we have to take it out from the rich. The reality is more of, for example, on sanitation, it's an innovation challenge of finding the solution. Thirdly, the one I think is very important is the political economy of urban land use. Vitally important issue if you want to understand whether we could be able to deal with urban poverty, or in Habitat 4, we will again have John Taylor asking us, what were your resolutions and did you fulfill them? And the answer will be in the negative. unless we address this issue of political economy also. There is a propensity among policymakers to think of slum eviction as the easy option, without considering that there can be other options which can also address the growth agenda. Inefficient land use. Dhaka is such a land scarce city, but the inefficiencies of land use is horrendous actually, not in focus. Potential of land pooling type of ideas haven't come into the Bangladesh discussion yet actually, should be taken on board. The financing challenge is virtually undiscussed. Where will the money come from? How do you generate it? Those are issues we have to discuss. So, conclude, it's a dual challenge. At one level, it's a challenge of perspective. What I mentioned earlier, reversing anti-poor urbanization rather than narrow focus on urban poor. So, it's not just only a few social protection programs. It's about the nature of urbanization. Prioritizing the urban spectrum rather than the primate city, which is Dhaka. And importance of both structural and non-structural solutions. Because we tend to underplay the non-structural solutions, which can be equally important. Behavioral norms are so important in producing the outcomes that we want. And it is also a challenge of action. Solutions have to come in both packages, big and small. Sometimes we are over-focused on big solutions, and the small solutions which can be realistic are ignored. And we have to prioritize innovations, which is very important, because in the urban context, land is very dense, land is scarce, money is scarce. Innovation has to be an integral part of how to move ahead on the urban poverty agenda and the bigger urban agenda. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. May I now request the chair of the session to initiate the launch of the research publication.
Okay. Now we'll have a launch. This research that I just presented, there's a book which has been published. In fact, rather heroically, within a week, we just got it this morning. So for those who want a copy, everyone will get a copy in this room, but you'll have to get it after lunch, which means that you have to come after lunch to the next session. That's not a incentive mechanism, but it's because the copies haven't arrived yet. But can I have the volumes which are to be opened? Joyanto? Yeah. Can you give one to each? So I'll request our guests to rise and perhaps we collectively unveil this book. The book is called The Urban Spectrum, Metropolitan to Mofussil. Can you just squeeze in a little bit? Thank you. Thank you, please. This is your copies. Thank you. Okay. So as I said, everyone will get a copy after lunch, and hopefully we shall have the copies by then. You can continue now.
It is now time for the dignitaries to share their words of wisdom. We start with a video message from our chief guest, the Honorable Minister for Planning, AHM Mustafa Kamal, FCA MP, who has unavoidably had to travel abroad.
থাকা সত্ত্বেও আজকে আপনাদের এই অনুষ্ঠানে আমি উপস্থিত হতে পারলাম না, তো আমি এই অনুষ্ঠানটির সকল প্রকার সফলতা কামনা করি। তো আমি পাশাপাশি ধন্যবাদ জানাবো। I will appreciate the effort of PPSC and BBS along with others including World Bank, UNDP NGOs, and also others who are connected with this event. This event is very, very vital and important and very, very significant right at the moment. You know, because SDG will have to achieve the targets of SDG. So, if you look at the 17 goals of SDGs, you will find number 11th goal is earmarked for this particular subject, covering this subject. Now, and urbanization is a matter of interest, is a matter of threat as well. At one point of time, we were thinking that we are moving to the cities, so it will be very good for us. But nowadays, what we feel that it is also right at the moment, it is a threat problem for us. So it is threatening in lot many ways. আমরা শহরে আসতাম, কারণ ছিল শহর লেখাপড়ার জন্য উপযুক্ত জায়গা, এখানে আসলে চাকরি পাওয়া যাবে, এখানে বসবাস করতে সুবিধা, এবং আরবান যে সমস্ত ফ্যাসিলিটিসগুলো আছে সেগুলোর জন্যই আমরা উই আর ইন এ র্যাট রেস, কার আগে কি আমরা শহরে আসব। কিন্তু শহরে অতিমাত্রায় এসে যাওয়ার কারণে এখন যা হচ্ছে সেটা হচ্ছে যে আমরা এখন বেনিফিট পাওয়ার চাইতে এখন আমাদের মনে হয় আমাদের এখানে একটু ফরগো আওয়ার দোজ টাইপ অফ বেনিফিটস। এখন অনেকেই চলে আসছেন শহরে, কিন্তু এখন এই শহরে আসাটা কিন্তু এটা কিন্তু আজকে একদিনের বিষয় নয়। এটা আমরা যদি গত 500 বছরের ইতিহাস আমরা যদি মূল্যায়ন করি, আমরা কি দেখতে পাই? 500 বছর থেকেই আমরা দেখি ইউরোপ যখন গ্রো করতেছিল, সেই ইউরোপে 500 বছর আগে আমরা লক্ষ্য করেছি যে সেখানে ওভার 10% অফ দি টোটাল পপুলেশন দে আর লিভিং ইন সিটিজ, টাউনস। সেখানে তো বড় শহর ছিল না, টাউন ছিল। টাউনগুলোতে গড়ে জনসংখ্যা ছিল 5000। তো যেখানে গড়ে জনসংখ্যা 5000, ওই 5000 জনগোষ্ঠীর জন্য মানুষজন শহর ওই টাউনগুলোতে এসে বসবাস করতে আরম্ভ করেছিল। তো এইভাবে আস্তে আস্তে যেখানেই শহর হয়েছে সেখানে জনবসতি হয়েছে। আমেরিকাতে এখন 70%-এর বেশি জনগোষ্ঠী শহরে বসবাস করে। আপনারা হয়তো জানেন 1950 সালে সারা বিশ্বে 36%-এর মতো মানুষ শহরে বসবাস করত। বয়টি হচ্ছে যে 2050-এ গিয়ে এটা হয়ে যাবে 66%। এটা ভয়াবহ ব্যাপার। এখন এই ভয়াবহ ব্যাপার সবাই এটাকে স্বীকার করে, কারণ সেই কারণেই আমাদের সরকারও এটার যে ভালো দিকটা আছে, ভালো দিকের সাথে খারাপ দিক যে বেশি। এখন এত মানুষ শহরে আসে ধারণ করতে পারবে না, শহর আর সেটা ধারণ করতে পারবে না, সেটা বিয়ার করতে পারবে না। সেই কারণেই আমরা বাংলাদেশে আমাদের যে পরিকল্পনা, সরকারের যে পরিকল্পনা, সেটা হচ্ছে আমরা জনগণকে শহরে আসলে যে সুযোগ সুবিধা পেত সেগুলো আমরা গ্রামে দেওয়ার ব্যবস্থা নিচ্ছি। আগে শহরে আসলে চাকরির ব্যবস্থা ছিল, এখন সেটা আমরা গ্রামে দেওয়ার জন্য আমরা স্পেশাল ইকোনমিক জোনস সারা দেশে 100টি মতো আমরা করছি। সুতরাং চাকরিটি তাদের এখন ডোর স্টেপে চলে যাবে, চাকরির সন্ধানে তাদেরকে শহরে আসতে হবে না। আমরা ভালো ভালো শিক্ষা প্রতিষ্ঠান একদম ইউনিভার্সিটি লেভেল পর্যন্ত আমরা উপজেলা লেভেলে নিয়ে যাচ্ছি। প্রত্যেকটা উপজেলায় আমরা একটা প্রতিষ্ঠান খাড়া করছি, সেখানে তারা মাস্টার্স পর্যন্ত, অনার্স মাস্টার্স পর্যন্ত লেখাপড়া করতে পারবে। এবং স্বাস্থ্য শুধু কমিউনিটি ক্লিনিক না, প্রত্যেকটা উপজেলায় আমরা মিনিমাম 100 বেড হাসপাতাল আমরা করছি। তো সেখানে আমরা মনে করি যে স্বাস্থ্যসেবা থেকে শুরু করে, শিক্ষা থেকে শুরু করে, কর্মসংস্থানের ব্যবস্থা থেকে শুরু করে সকল ব্যবস্থাই আমরা এনশিওর করব গ্রামাঞ্চলে। এবং এতে বিশ্বাস করি যে আমাদের শহরে আসার জন্য যে ইনফ্লাক্সটা, শহরে আসার জন্য যে প্রতিযোগিতা এবং যে প্রবণতা ছিল, এটা কমে আসবে। তো আমি আবারও বলবো, এটি সুন্দর উদ্যোগ, এবং আমি বিশ্বাস করি আজকের যে আমরা আয়োজন করলেন, সেই আয়োজন থেকে, আলোচনা থেকে আমি অনেক কিছু আমিও এখানে নতুন করে পাবো, জানবো, এবং সেটা আমার আগামী দিনের কর্মপরিকল্পনা সেটা অবশ্যই আমি গ্রহণ করব। আমি আবারও আপনাদের সবাইকে আন্তরিকভাবে ধন্যবাদ জানাবো এবং দুঃখ প্রকাশ করছি আবারও যে আমি এখানে থাকতে পারলাম না। আগামীতে অবশ্যই দেখা হবে আপনাদের সাথে। আপনাদের সবাইকে আন্তরিকভাবে ধন্যবাদ। আমি খুব
Now I request our guest of honor, Professor Wahiduddin Mahmood, former advisor of the caretaker government, to illuminate us with his wise words.
Thank you, distinguished guests. It won't be very much of a wise voice. It will be just footnotes of what has been already being said by the previous speakers. In fact, what I wanted to say have been touched upon by the previous distinguished speakers. So let me go straight to the subject. Why we should, what is the justification of this workshop, and why should we, and these studies, and why should we particularly focus at urban poverty? First of all, if we look at the proportion of the total national, at the national level, if we go by the BBS head count of poverty, then the proportion of urban poor in total poor of the country has not been actually increasing. Maybe worldwide experience, as Mig was saying, was different. But in Bangladesh, you see, although urban population has been increasing very fast, but since mid-90s, the incidence of headcount poverty in urban areas, particularly in terms of extreme poverty, has been increasing much faster than in rural areas, unlike maybe the global experience, what you were saying. So that it's not the headcount proportion of the conventionally estimated poor people, the proportion urban population is in, urban poor is increasing in terms of the out of the total poor in the country. But why we should look at urban poverty in particular is because of the characteristics of the urban poverty. A BBS estimation of urban poverty is in terms of income poverty, just you're looking at the income. But if you look at the other aspects of human well-being, and which is covered in the conceptualization of UNDP's human poverty, look at the health and educational outcomes, then in some of these non-income aspects, the extreme and the worst forms of, and the most obstinate forms of human deprivation and lack of well-being occurs in some parts of urban population compared to rural population. It may be, say, in terms of even education, primary enrollment in primary education, where in rural areas it's almost 100%. In some parts of urban slums, it's much less. Maybe it has to do, the research will look into the whether it's something to do with the compatibility of rural combining work and schooling, and the urban type of that compatibility has something to do with that. Then also some extreme forms of extreme poverty, as I said, is in urban areas, and the government, we have the State Minister, Mr. Mannan, whose government I think is very enthusiastic and supportive about these SDG goal of eradicating extreme poverty. And if you want to achieve that, you will have to look at urban poverty, because some of the extreme forms of poverty occurs in urban areas. And Ming Jiang also mentioned one thing about the difference between the nature of urban and rural poverty, and I give you a concrete example in terms of our statistics, poverty estimates. In rural areas in any year, you will see that if you estimate poverty, compare by the poverty, the income poverty line, if you go by the by income, and we call it income poverty, then income poverty is much higher than consumption poverty if you consider the consumption expenditure and compare it with the poverty line. That's because in rural areas you have many forms of informal insurance, mutual help. There are people who have temporary loss of income due to some livelihood shocks can rely upon the mutual support of the community. In urban areas, people live separately, so that sort of support is not there. So that's one very important distinction between urban and rural poverty. In terms of the why David has asked this question, why both policymakers and economists have in the past neglected looking at urban poverty and has done more work on rural poverty. One reason was the assumption and thinking that urban poverty is a spillover of rural poverty, so that poverty has to be tackled where it is generated, which is rural areas. But if you distinguish between and urban poverty is through migration from rural areas. But if you look at the type of some research is there, the rural-urban migration, you can detect two types of migration. One is push effect. Those who become destitute, like river erosion and other things, are forced to come to urban areas. These are the, I mean, they don't go for any economic upward mobility. In fact, when they arrive in urban areas, most of them are even, they experience even decline in that compared to their rural position. But research has shown that most of the rural-urban migration in Bangladesh takes place for represent upward economic mobility, and that's why rural-urban migration is something which we should encourage, because this is the main vehicle through which poverty will be reduced and economic mobility will take place among those who are trapped in poverty. It is the push type of migration, destitution in rural areas, where safety net programs or rural non-farm activities should be geared towards retaining them in rural areas. But for those who want to come to urban areas for upward economic mobility, we should encourage that process, because that is how urbanization is inevitable, and that's how economic upward mobility will take place. Excuse me. But even if most of the rural-urban migration is represents upward economic mobility, even then, for several reasons, urban poverty should be looked at and remains important. First, those who come to urban areas even for better economic life, they will be initially absorbed in the informal low-income parts of the urban livelihoods, so that they will be part of urban, inevitably they will be part of urban poverty. In fact, a phenomena which is taking place now, some labor force studies show that there is much more female migration from rural areas to urban areas taking place these days, which are not, unlike in previous times, are not related to their joining their family and husbands and becoming housewives in urban areas, but this is parts of female labor markets. They come to urban areas for better employment. But given the gender discriminations in everywhere for the same type of work, female workers get less, even in ready-made garments, so that those female workers who come to urban areas, they live, even if it represents a betterment of their living standards, well-being, because they come voluntarily, but they live in a twilight of poverty and non-poverty things. So they unless gender discrimination and gender disadvantages of urban female workers are taken, looked at, they will comprise part of urban poverty. And of course, urban poverty will remain important even when migration represents upward economic mobility, because of the non-income, as I said, non-income aspects of poverty, like health and economic outcomes. And lastly, urban poverty is important, as Ming, I think, referred to, is that as urban population is increasing in size, some of urban poverty will be reproduced within the urban areas through the second generation urban population of migrants. And so that the education and health outcomes of the children of the migrants are important for future urban poverty. That brings me to my final topic, which I wanted to discuss, is and also Zellu said, should we look at policies for urban poverty, eradicating urban poverty, or should we talk about pro-poor or poverty reducing urban growth? I think that should be the approach. And that is part of a bigger problem, the type of urbanization we have. The fact that Dhaka contributes to 2/3 of incremental GDP, so that Dhaka is a growth engine. At the same time, Dhaka is also one of the least livable cities in the world. So that livability, lack of livability, impact of that is borne by the urban poor. That's where we are talking of the non-income aspects of urban life, in terms of sanitation, in terms of health, in environmental health, and that brings us to the entire economy of slum dwellers, their livelihoods and their living standards, which you will be discussing in your studies in the next sessions. But that brings me to a final question. This is a question which I have raised in international seminars of urban economics, where contemporary leading urban economists were there, and they talk these days of smart cities, which take care of slums, take care of how to combine people, the labor force of all sorts, those who live in slums and others. The question is, if there is a mega city which is extremely congested, it's an undeniable fact that to give them enough civic amenities in terms of transport, in terms of minimum health facilities, and in terms of living conditions, it's extremely costly to have an underground metro system, to have any decent public transport is an extremely costly thing in a highly congested mega city. Even in New York, even in London,